In just the last couple of weeks, the abortion landscape in the U.S. has changed drastically. Last week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed into law an abortion ban that could save thousands of lives. The Heartbeat Protection Act bans abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy. It also prohibits state funding for abortions for non-Florida residents and funding for dangerous chemical abortion drugs. This has been a long time coming in a majority red state, though a lawsuit concerning Florida's 15-week limit on abortion could keep this new law from taking immediate effect. And the U.S. Supreme Court is set to weigh in on a case out of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that could ban sending the abortion drug mifepristone through the mail. This is developing coverage. The case is Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus U.S. Food and Drug Administration. It originated in a northern Texas district court presided over by Trump-appointed Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk. The case was elevated to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which ruled that abortion pills must be received by a doctor in person no later than 7 weeks gestation. Now we wait to see if the High Court will affirm that ruling or send it back to lower courts. Joining me now with more details on what comes next in this case is Mary FioRito. She's an attorney and a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Mary, thanks so much for joining me. Talk to me about who brought this case to the courts in the first place and what they were seeking. Why did they choose this avenue of the courts to try and stop mail order abortions?
Well, the suit was brought by a group of doctors, collectively and individually. The Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine would be an umbrella group of doctors like the Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the American College of Pediatricians, and then several doctors in their capacity as individual doctors, several of those who worked in emergency rooms. And they brought the case to the federal court because that would be the normal channel by which you could challenge an FDA ruling. This particular ruling on the drug mifepristone with its partner drug misoprostol was approved for abortion use back in the year 2000 in the waning days of the Clinton administration. It was very dramatically sort of forced through on an expedited basis. And the argument that the government used at the time, that the Clinton administration and the drug company used at the time, was that this was needed for emergencies, that this was the only drug that could be used in particular emergency situations, which really wasn't the case, because we know that pregnancies are not generally life-threatening in an emergent sense. And the judge in that case, Judge Kacsmaryk, found that the FDA exceeded its authority by ignoring what he called legitimate safety concerns about mifepristone, and that they relied on unsound reasoning and studies when they approved it, so that he really felt that there were significant safety concerns, and those were all amplified by the groups of doctors, especially the emergency room doctors, who are, for the most part, the first physicians that see a woman who is having an adverse reaction to this combination of pills.
Right. And talk to me a little bit more about that, Mary. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals made a point to point out that not only does these drugs affect the women who are taking them, it harms them, but it's really a liability for these ER doctors who are receiving these women into emergency rooms. Talk to me about that and your perspective on it.
Well, it is very interesting to see the perspective of these emergency room doctors. As I mentioned, they're on the front lines of women who are coming in with severe abdominal pain, hemorrhaging that won't stop, other pain and other concerns that they oftentimes, the baby will not pass completely. And they have to then undergo procedures for this woman that essentially amount to them being complicit in an abortion surgery, which a number of them, they have ethical objections to them, that their conscience clauses as doctors allows them to state when they're practicing medicine. They don't have to be involved in performing or doing these abortions. But when women present in the emergency room with an incomplete abortion, they're put into the position of having to complete that abortion for her. And even in the cases where the baby has already died, that still puts a doctor in a terribly difficult situation. Of course, they're not culpable morally. because they had no intent to do it, and they need to save that woman who has now come in with significant complications. But it's incredibly traumatic. I mean, I have a couple of doctors who are emergency room physicians on call, and a number of them have had cases, one with a surgical abortion where there was a perforated uterus, but the other one where there was a chemical abortion that hadn't completed. And it didn't only upset them, tremendously to have to see the baby's remains in that little pan next to the patient, but also the nurses and the anesthesiologists and the other staff that were in the room. In one case I know of, the hospital actually had to bring in counselors for the medical staff that had to treat this woman. So, the other side would have you believe that this is no different from taking an Advil or a Tylenol, and then you go home and somehow the baby mysteriously disappears. But that could not be further from the truth. There can be significant, not only adverse medical reactions to this drug, but also, emotional and psychological ones.
Right.
Probably the most prominent, if the woman does complete the abortion at home and she passes the baby's remains, I'm sorry for being graphic here, but that often happens while she's sitting on the toilet, and she can look down and see that small amniotic sac. And if she's having that abortion, as late as the FDA was allowing it after 2016, which was a full 10 weeks, she can very easily come face to face with a small, tiny child. And then, she goes through the additional trauma of flushing the toilet. So you can imagine what, people who do Project Rachel counseling or other post-abortion counseling are experiencing when they are caring for these women who have undergone these procedures.
Yeah, well, thank you for being so candid and explaining that, Mary. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us and for sharing what you know about this case. Really appreciate it. Mary FioRito of the Ethics and Public Policy Center.